This video is introducing the next project on this channel, which is to create a CMS, a content management system from scratch. The primary goal of this project is to simplify to the greatest degree possible and to have it so that you can all see the code. I'm going to link the code in the description as I go along, and nothing will be hidden or compiled in a DLL. Everything will be raw source files. So to give an example, here on the right-hand side of the screen, I have the actual file system as it exists so far. There's not very much to it. It's mostly folders. Let me check here, properties. So far, I have 13 files and 8 folders. So the main thing I wanted to point out at this stage is I'm using this built-in app_code folder, which in .NET Framework is used to store raw code files that are compiled at runtime. So you don't have to pre-compile them. You could, but you don't have to. And so by deploying the CMS this way, it keeps it simple in the sense that everyone can see and modify the source code. And that is a primary goal of this project. And then you can see I've kind of broken it up as a folder for styles, for scripts. So it's not necessarily JavaScript. It could be other forms of scripting, fonts, files, images, etc. And then we have pages. So for example, ASPX files, modules, which is my preferred term for user controls. So this is holding ASCX files and their corresponding source code. And then I just have this default.aspx to be able to handle requests. And I may not even necessarily need this file. I might get rid of it later if I'm trying to simplify. And then just a basic web config. But real quick, let me switch over to the left-hand side of the screen and talk about the overall scope, and then I'll show where the code is at so far, and that'll probably be it for this video. So I thought about, what do I need in a CMS? I've installed and used several CMSs in the past couple of months, both for work and for personal projects. So I was just sketching out ideas of what I've seen and what I've used. And I'm not sure that I'll implement all of these for this project, but this is a good starting place for scope. So first, I'll just talk about like the front end. On-page controls is how I noted that here in the text file. So I may have a log out button. I'll probably have some sort of button to or link to toggle editing controls, and then there will probably be some form of sidebar. Pretty much every CMS has a sidebar, and then that sidebar would probably link you to an administration page and or link you to the subpages where you can actually perform actions more directly. So there's really not a ton that is necessary on the front end. Now there is the WYSIWYG editor is something that I might save for a future project. So for this project, I might just kind of hand wave and say, imagine that you edited the content and then have the rest of the CMS around that be fully functional. A WYSIWYG editor might be a future project. I briefly read about it in forums, and pretty much everyone universally agrees that that is a very difficult problem. So let's talk then about actual settings that we might have. So like if I go over here to the pages folder, that's what this configure is meant to be, is you're logged in, you're authenticated. Basically admins would have access to this, and then maybe someone with lower permissions would be on some other page, but I'll probably physically separate out the pages that do the processing, in addition to having roles and authentication. But yeah, settings. So there might be some general settings, having a site title, site logo, and then maybe counting the number of revisions that you're going to keep. And that could also be 0 if you're not going to keep any history of prior revisions. Security will mostly be around users and authentication. So whether or not users can stay logged in across multiple sessions, whether or not users can register themselves, whether or not email will be forced to be verified as part of the onboarding process, whether or not admins are necessary to approve new users, etc. For this project, I think I'm going to assume that your login name is your email address. It doesn't necessarily have to be, but for this project, it will be, et cetera, et cetera. And then authentication, maybe you're going to use Active Directory or LDAP. I don't have a local server to test that with, so I might either skip this or hand wave it a little bit and write some code that should work. But I'll probably focus more on database-based authentication. And then, of course, in addition to general and security settings, there will be a roles section where we need the ability to search for roles, add, edit, delete, modify membership. And then for permissions, a lot of these permissions I'm thinking would be admin only. So only admins would be modifying URL redirects and rewrites, caching controls, creating and modifying modules, managing users. And then I think the creating, updating, and deleting of roles would also be admin only. So the only permissions that might not be admin only would be around pages, media, and content. And then maybe also delegating membership management of roles. So I'm still kind of thinking about how roles will work and what makes sense there. And then there would probably be a users section where, similar to everything else, you can search, add, edit, delete. And then I thought it might also be good to have a one-click ability to log in as another user if you're an admin. Pages, similar. We probably need an ability to modify the hierarchy, create new pages, etc., etc. And then, yeah, page content, similar. You need to be able to search, add, delete, modify permissions. Server logs, yeah, we're going to want an ability to quickly view server logs without having to go into the file system. Caches, so we'll probably have a mechanism to cache bust CMS, images, maybe scripting, etc. And so the idea is I'll probably have separate toggles for cache busting different types of files. And I would imagine this would pretty much be on all the time unless there was a performance impact. So for example, if you had a page with 1,000 images and you're doing some form of cache busting, which would probably mean you're reading the file last write time and you're appending that to the URL in some kind of parameter, reading that file last write time for all 1,000 files maybe would be a performance impact. I guess it would depend on the specifics, but the idea is I think there should at least be some kind of toggle here so you're not forcing cache busting to be on, but it should be available at some level. Then there's also URLs, so redirects and rewrites, and then modules themselves. So users should be able to create their own user controls, throw them onto the file system, and then link those within the CMS. And that's pretty much it. And then for file manager, I thought about this. I wasn't quite sure what direction I wanted to go. And I think the decision that I made is all of the above. So rather than managing files just in the file system or just in the database, I'm going to do both. So you can see over here on the right-hand side, I just have a files folder on the file system. So that's going to be half of it. And then the other half will be in the database. Let me pull up the database here. So this is what I've put together so far. So you can see I have a files table. And so that's the other half of the media management. But yeah, tables are fairly straightforward. There's contents, files, modules, pages, roles, settings, URLs, user roles, and users. Now, I know this will change, but this is just what I've put together so far. So for a user, they might have all these various fields. This is just a joining table between users and roles. Roles pretty much just have a name and description. As far as settings, that's just a generic table with classification, name, and label and value. And that way, we can just store all the settings here. We can add new entries, and that'll dynamically create our administration pages for settings as far as like different tabs. So each tab might represent a classification, and then you'd have a set of these names, labels, and values. So the label and value would be what you really see on the front end, and then the name is like the HTML form input name, the key that actually links everything together. Roles, not a whole lot there, pretty much just a name. Pages would probably have a parent page ID, some sort order in the hierarchy, URL, title, which roles can view it, edit, create pages underneath it, etc. And then this is a joining table between pages and modules. Modules, aka user controls, would have a location, I guess, either on the file system or maybe they could even be stored in the database. I haven't quite thought about that yet. And then they would just be given a name and a description. And they might also have some settings. I figured that this would just be like a catch-all field. So this would probably hold maybe JSON or something, and that could just hold arbitrary settings that apply to that particular user control. And then we'd have some sort of editor that interprets the JSON. I'd probably keep it fairly flat and have it pretty much just be a list of key value pairs. But again, I haven't really thought about details yet. I'm just sort of shotgunning at a very high level how I think this might all fit together. And then for files, the representative URL, the actual data of the file, and yeah, this file master ID, I think that's how I'm going to handle history, is the file master ID will hold the ID of the original file. And so within the group of every historical file for a given file, they'd share a file master ID, but of course everything would have a unique ID because that's the primary key. And then the date created is how you would implicitly sort groups of revisions or histories of files. And so you'd take the most recent one, and so the most recent one would be active. And then anything that's not the most recent with a given file master ID would not be active. So every time you add an entry to this table, you'd have to look at the file master ID, or you look at the group of data that shares the file master ID, and then you'd have to make sure that only one of them is active, whichever one was updated most recently. And then contents, similarly, I have a content master ID and an active bit. So very, very similar between contents and files. And I haven't really thought about specifics as far as encryption, but of course that's a layer that you could always add over the top in the future. So now real quick, and then we'll end the video. I just want to look over all this code here. So the web config is very minimal right now. It pretty much just has an HTTP module to link up this code that will do URL handling. The default.aspx page is just making a call under the hood to this pages/default.aspx. We have an empty styling file, an empty script file, Error.htm is for handling the worst errors where .NET Framework can't handle the error itself. And then I have a couple of other pages. So this default.aspx will be the default handler for displaying content on the screen. And so far, all it really has is a number of placeholders for like messages. I might split this out into success messages and error messages. And then we have a left, center, and right content, footer, header. That's pretty much it. And then the configure file is what I figured would serve content for administrators for the backend portion of the site. This main menu user control in the modules folder was just a proof of concept example of pulling in a user control. And you'll note up here that I'm calling code file as opposed to code behind, because we're not compiling any of the source code into a DLL. We're literally going to deploy the source code itself, and that will just make it easier for people to get up to speed as quickly as possible. And then in the app code directory, we have these two files of code. So this is the URL handler, which is an HTTP module. It's required to implement the dispose method, and then we just have an init method. So a lot of this is boilerplate stuff. We're just getting the HTTP application, making sure it's not null. We're getting the current path. And then basically this here, we're ignoring any physical files and directories on the server. And then for consistency, we are getting rid of any trailing slashes. And this is where we're handling URL redirects. Now in the future, this will probably be reading from a list of redirects from the database, similar to the URL rewrites. This will probably be stored in a database, but for now, for the sake of demonstration and testing, I just have, if it equals this, then we're going to do that type of thing. And that's all there is so far in that source code. And then this is where we're actually loading a module. So I have a static class module and a function here to load, or a method to load. And so all that's doing is that's loading the control. And then if it fails to load the control, then it's going to find the messages control, and it's going to add a new literal, and it's basically going to throw in this HTML message. So if we go back over here to default.aspx, you'll remember there's this messages placeholder here. But yeah, so that's a very quick overview of where I'm at. I think in the next video, I'll get into actually doing some initial coding, and we'll be able to show something on the screen. Thanks for watching.